And thank you all for coming today to this event, and the organizers of this event, I really want to thank you, and thank you for taking the day to highlight the protections and quality of life for our seniors. 4 years ago, I created the Aging and Long-Term Care Committee in the Minnesota Senate. It was long overdue. Our seniors had never been a priority. They were an afterthought when it came to legislation that needed to be done to protect them. There were so many issues confronting our seniors, from elder abuse and neglect to financial exploitation. The issues facing our seniors never made it to the top of the list, and their voice was squelched here at the Capitol. No one was fighting for them. Having gone through my own personal experience with a family member and the difficulty getting answers and finding protections, I made it my personal mission. I was going to protect our most vulnerable, our elderly. We have thousands of seniors living in assisted living facilities, yet we were the only state in the country that didn't have any oversight or licensing structures surrounding these facilities. I worked very hard to get the Elder Care and Protection Act passed last year. That will end up changing that. After decades of being forgotten, we finally got it done. Thankfully, in that package was the provision that we were able to fast track the legislation that allowed for family members to place cameras in their loved ones' rooms. I can't imagine where we would be right now if that hadn't happened, especially now during this COVID lockdown. Lord only knows how many lives these cameras have saved. Which brings me to COVID and a lack of leadership from the Walz administration. To date, more than 70% of lives lost due to COVID are in our long-term care facilities. I will hold Governor Walz responsible for those lost lives. I know that's harsh, but it's the truth. Case in point, we knew back in February that COVID was coming and it was going to affect our seniors the hardest. They were the most at risk for losing their lives. There was the science and the data that proved we needed to focus on protecting them. We had evidence from China and Italy and New York. This virus was the most dangerous for our seniors, and they were the most vulnerable. Yet, there was no plan from Governor Walz nor his administration. Our seniors were scared, especially those living in congregate care settings, such as nursing homes and assisted living facilities. It's windy. The caregivers at these facilities were also frightened because they were given no direction from the Walz administration. The management and owner of these facilities were asking and begging for a plan. Please give us some guidance. But nothing came. It was the Wild West, and every facility was hung out to dry at the expense of our seniors. Then on March 12th, the governor granted himself executive power so that he and he alone could make these decisions of what would happen to our loved ones. And he decided to lock them down with no contact with the outside. The governor said we needed to flatten the curve and make sure we had enough ICU beds and ventilators for all those that were going to die. He allocated that all personal protective equipment he could get, from masks to gowns, all went to the hospitals. Yet remember, we knew if we followed the science, those most at risk were our seniors living in long-term care facilities, yet they got nothing. You had caregivers wearing ponchos, rain ponchos, and homemade masks because our seniors were at the bottom of the list of priorities. Governor Walz had warehouses full of these protections, yet he was hoarding it for the onslaught of needs we were going to need in the Minnesota hospitals. That never happened. This is not where our deaths were occurring, and the science and data showed it from the get-go. Yet the science and data was ignored by the Walz administration. His secret model that he and only he could see, which was developed by 2 college kids, said that 70,000 people were going to die to COVID by the end of May. 70,000 people. He wanted to instill the fear in all of us. We were all at risk of dying, when we already knew that the only ones that needed protection were those who were the most at risk, living in long-term care facilities. After weeks of demanding that we see his secret model, he adjusted his projected deaths to 30,000 because it was obvious that his model made no sense. There was no science and data to support it, yet he stuck to his guns. Not only did he stick to his guns, he even doubled down, spending $7 million on a refrigerated warehouse to store the human remains of the dead. To date, there is not one person's remains in this warehouse. Also to date, There's not 70,000 deaths due to COVID. There's not even 30,000 deaths. There have been 2,200 deaths, and more than 70% of them were in our long-term care facilities. We knew from the beginning that the mortality rate is much higher in persons over the age of 85, but nothing was ever done to protect them. The governor canceled all gatherings. Stay at home, wear your mask, and by all means, you are not allowed to see your loved ones if they're living in a long-term care facility. You'll hear heartbreaking stories today of seniors that have died from loneliness, depression, and no human contact. You'll hear stories of family members in hospice that weren't allowed to say their last goodbye to their parent or spouse. And yet, to disregard human life even more, our governor canceled all funerals. You're just going to have to mourn your loved one later, he said.
Unless you're George Floyd.
Yet, during this same time, he attended the funeral for George Floyd, where more than 500 people gathered. One set of rules for him, and another set of rules for us. You've heard Senator Scott Jensen talk about the governor's model and that how his numbers weren't working. As it turned out, there weren't going to be 70,000 deaths in Minnesota, so he needed to boost the numbers, so he directed physicians to alter the death certificates of anyone that died and reported it was a death due to COVID. And when Senator Scott Jensen got national attention for the wrongdoings of this administration, he was bullied and penalized by the department and threatened to take down his medical practice. Again, don't cross or question the governor. This was his regime, and he had all of the control. There were so many secrets, and there was absolutely no transparency. I was screaming from the rooftops for the real data to be released. What facilities had cases of COVID? What percentage were employees? What percentage were residents? How many of these folks were already in hospice care? How many facilities had outbreaks? How many facilities were being tested? And how long did it take for the results to be returned? And how many had deaths? We deserve to know the real data. It wasn't until I threatened a legislative subpoena and went to the media that they disclosed the data. And it continues to be a struggle to get the real data from the administration. Just this month, they changed what they will disclose to us. Right. They will no longer include daily hospitalizations and ICU occupancy numbers on the MDH website. Remember, this was all about flattening the curve and keeping the beds open in ICU. Now we don't even know how full or empty our ICUs are. We had the data back in April. More than 80% then of the deaths were happening in our long-term care facilities. Exactly what we knew back in February. There it was in black and white, the real data. We have to protect our elderly. Get them the personal protective gear and get it to them immediately. Give them top priority on COVID testing. Deliver some guidance to these facilities for a plan on visits, yet the governor still did not prioritize our seniors. Instead, while testing was in short supply, he offered free testing for those who attended the riots. He set up drive-through testing spots throughout the Twin Cities for anyone who was at the riots, whether they had symptoms or not. Come on down and get tested. There were lines around the block for this free testing. We had a shortage of tests, and they were allowed to get free tests. And in the meantime, our seniors were locked up with no protective gear or testing, dying from loneliness and no human contact. To make matters even worse, our governor and his administration thought it was okay to discharge active COVID patients from hospitals into nursing homes. This made absolutely no sense. We had the science and the data that this increases the deaths. Other states immediately stopped this practice, but not Governor Walz. He had a refrigerated building that he needed to fill. I received so many calls and letters from desperate folks begging for help, and many of the stories you'll hear today. We've got Sandy Hayner and her photos of her grandfather with Alzheimer's before he was in lockdown and then after lockdown. We held press conferences, worked with the local newspapers and television stations, begging the governor to listen to these families, the residents, the caregivers, but the governor refused to listen because he had his secret model and he was sticking to it. Our seniors were dying, and you couldn't see them on their deathbed, and you couldn't say goodbye, and you couldn't mourn them at a funeral. Our elderly deserve better. They have been patient long enough. This is not how they saw their waning years. They want to be there with their families. Winter is almost here. It feels like it's here today. And the outside visits are ending. Our seniors deserve a plan, and that plan has to come from the governor because to date, he has failed you. There are hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans that demand he give our facilities a plan, one that protects our seniors while allowing them a decent quality of life in their last years. They didn't ask for this, and they shouldn't have to pay the price. Again, thank you all for coming and showing this governor that I am not alone in this fight to protect our seniors. Thank you.